All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is a great turnout. Thanks for everyone for coming out on such a beautiful summer evening. We have a good number of folks here from our Governor's STEM Institute here who are here for a 2-week summer camp. So if you are a Govy here for this summer, give us a cheer. Woo! Thank you all for joining us this evening. And I recognize many other faces in the audience, so I know we have a good turnout from our local community here. How many of you have been down to Fort Warwick before and seen the site? Fantastic. How many of you have actually been there for a dig? A good number of folks. Excellent. I myself am super excited to learn more about what they have found this past year. So I am going to introduce Bob Sheets, who many of you probably know, to introduce our speakers tonight.
Good evening, and I'd like to know how many students are in the camp from Pocahontas County. Would you hold a hand? Young people, congratulations. Yeah, I'm glad you've taken advantage of this opportunity here in your home county. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. It's my honor tonight to introduce two of my really good friends, because within the past 20 years, as I've worked closely with the Doctors McBride on Fort Warwick, they're actually really nice people, graduates of Boulogne College, and got their graduate degrees at their PhDs at Michigan State University, took their talents to Lexington, Kentucky, where they established McBride Archaeological Services, and worked extensively with Camp Nelson in Lexington, Kentucky, which is now a national monument, which is a testimony to their endeavor, dedication, and passion for archaeology. If you don't know it, Camp Nelson is where the Black troops were recruited and trained to serve in the Union Army during the Civil War. And Dr. McBride tells me that for years, it was his task to explain to the people of Kentucky that they did not secede. They were a Union state. Both of them are preeminent members of the Society for Historical Archaeology. Dr. Kim McBride is a past president. They made a presentation about our project at the conference in New Orleans in January, and my wife and I were fortunate enough to attend. And it is just with great pleasure that I asked my grandson to stand up over here, if you would. Rhett, would you stand up? Well, that is the 10th generation to live at Fort Warwick. Now I give you Dr. Stephen and Dr. Kim McBride.
Great. Well, thank you, Bob, and thanks to everyone for coming. We certainly could not have accomplished what you're going to hear about today if it hadn't been for the help of Bob and the entire Sheets family. Maybe we'll see some pictures as we go on. So I do need to just I show you some pictures here of some of our supporters. We had a grant from kind of a core grant. Gotta learn what distance is good for this, from the Appalachian Forest National Heritage Area. And then we had matching funds, as you can see, from a host of other institutions. And that's actually not everyone. And I sort of left out the Pocahontas County Board of Education, the Lions Clubs, local Lions Clubs, to provide the bus money to get the students to the site. So it really has been a very wonderful and broad community effort to do this research. And a super grateful thank you to the Green Bank Observatory. This is just a wonderful facility, and it's really great to be a part of a science camp, the Governor's Science School. Our history with them goes back a number of years. I'm thinking these pictures you see here are from 2008, and they're helping us with geophysical survey and some shovel test pits. And then I know some students came out last year and did some screening of soils. And we're going to repeat that activity tomorrow with some of you. So thank you so much. And hopefully as we go through this talk, you science students will learn a little bit about the inferences that archaeologists try to make to connect the data as we find it in the ground, in this case, after several hundred years, with our theories and our hypotheses about frontier life. So today, there's many things we could talk to you about, but we're really focusing on one of the main questions for this recent grant, which is the structure of Fort Warwick. Something that's kind of puzzled us for a long time, and especially as we compare Fort Warwick to some other forts that we've excavated further down in the Greenbrier Valley. We have, I hope you'll get a sense as we go along today of our sources. The archaeology is our most important source for learning about the structure of the sites, but we're putting together information from the documentary record and in some cases also from the oral history record. Our previous research suggests to us that in the Greenbrier Valley, we have typically sort of a typology of forts. And some of the main types are the 2 bastion stockades built by the militia. And as we go along today, I'll talk a little bit more about the militia. And we're going to show you some examples of Arbuckle's and Cook's forts in Greenbrier and Monroe counties. But you also get simple houses that would serve as a fort during this frontier period. And some of those, as I'll show you some pictures, such as Donnelly's Fort in Greenbrier and Jarrett's in Monroe, are much more irregular. And irregular is kind of a good word to warn you about what we're going to learn about at Warwick's Fort. It's really taught us to not have too many preconceived ideas about these forts. And then you also just have block houses or a single strong house. Here's pictures of those 2 I mentioned, Arbuckle's Fort on the left and Cook's Fort on the right. And if you can see these little things that poke out, this here, right there for Cook's, and for Arbuckle's right there and down there. These are what we call a bastion. And a bastion is it's a sort of a French term, but it's an area in a fort that projects out from the main fort wall and provides a way for the militiamen to stand there and cover, or enfilade, the more technical term, or fire their gun down the line of the fort. So technically, if you have 2 bastions, you can cover all 4 walls. So this is the very efficient style of fort building. Some forts actually have 4 bastions, and in some cases they actually have more. But we've kind of, come to think of this as our most common fort design. And it's a little bit bolstered by our documentary record. This picture that you're looking at is very rare. This is a drawing made by a man who participated in the frontier wars with the Native Americans, Captain Spencer Records. Now, he is doing this many years later in 1842. And this is part of a document set called the Draper Manuscripts that we use heavily. It's the core of the Wisconsin Historical Society's collections, and it's just a wonderful source. But if you can see in his, and this is a quote from Spencer Records, he talks about 2 bastions were constructed at opposite corners. So it's not just what we've been finding in the ground, but it's this documentary record that kind of led us to believe this is what we're going to find at Warwick's Fort. Here's the example of one of the slightly more irregular forts I mentioned. This is Donnelly's Fort in Greenbrier County, and you can see it does have 2 bastions, but this fort was built around a pre-existing keys are hard with these mics. House, Andrew Donnelly's house, was probably here for a few years, right there before it was fortified. But they did still build the 2 bastions. Now here's even more irregular. This is David Jarrett's fort in Monroe County. And we again think this was a pre-existing house that they fortified. So they took the area around the chimney of the house and made a bastion there. And again, the purpose of that bastion would be so a man could stand in there and fire a gun, in this case, kind of down the line along the side of the house. And you can see a little bit here how Stephen McBride actually did this drawing, but he did it based on the archaeological findings. So what you see on the left, this is getting a little weaker, I'm sorry to say about that. Andrea, is there a pointer as part of this? I'm afraid. Well, now it's great on my hand, but that's all right. It's okay. Hey. That is like super bright. Oh, wow. Thank you. Go green, right? Okay. This is the site plan. This is what we found. I'll try not to use it too much. I love it though. This is what we found in the ground. And then here is the same thing, kind of stylized for you. And you can see our little dashed lines. Then we've done the drawing based on what we found. So we found this cellar foundation. We found this chimney that tells us about the house. We found a stain in the ground from this bastion. There's a gate entrance. So this, experience at Jarrett's did prepare us a little bit for the difficulties that lay ahead for our Warwick's Fort investigations. Now, I should back up a little bit more. I've just been talking to you about forts, but why did they need these forts and how did they function? The forts were part of a local defensive system that was really honed beginning a little bit before the French and Indian War, but through the French and Indian War in the 1750s. And then we had another conflict in 1763 called Pontiac's War. But these forts worked together with the militia, and the militia is an ancient English institution. This was an English colony at the time. And then you had specialized militia called scouts, or more commonly in the records called Indian spies. And they roamed around often in pairs, one guy by himself or maybe with a partner, hopefully having a horse, but not always. And their job was to look for signs of Native Americans being in the area and then to report back. And if they saw the signs, they would hope that the settlers would heed the alarm and come into the forts. So some of the forts, were built by militia, but some were also built by settlers. They were almost all seasonally used as a base for the militia and these scouts. But also in times of danger, they were a crucial point of safety for the settlers to come into. And you're going to see a quote later in the talk from Peter Warwick, Warwick descendant, who talks about settlers spending weeks at a time in Warwick's fort. So that's a really informative bit of information from us. Now in Kentucky, where Stephen and I did live for a number of years and did similar research on frontier settlements, the settlers there had to live in the forts all summer long, pretty much in the middle 1770s, because it was so dangerous. But here our sense is that the settlers mostly stayed on their farmsteads and only came into the forts for short periods. This research has been that we were focusing on in this grant, really, though, it has a long history. We began this project in 1990, so that's way before all you science camp folks were born. We had a grant from the West Virginia Department of Culture and History to do a survey for 14 forts, I believe, and Warwick's was one of those. So we were, relying on local tradition at that time, came out to the site and were shown, where oral history said the fort had been located. And then we didn't get to come back until 2004. But starting in 2004, every couple of years, we would be able to have some grant funding to come and do archaeology. So we've kind of, slowly over the years put together a picture of what we thought this fort looked like, but we had a lot of big questions remaining that we hope to address in this present season and with the benefit of these, for us, larger than usual grants. And I have to also say a shout out here to Jed Sheets, who's sitting right over there. The work with the track hoe that you're going to see the results of, we probably would still be out there scratching our heads about what does Warwick's fort look like had we not had that expertise allow us to just move a lot of dirt, faster. You wonder maybe a little bit about our sources. The pensions, this is a quote you see here from a pension statement of William Kennerly. In the 1830s, there were some laws passed that granted pensions to Revolutionary War soldiers, but to get their pension, they had to file an application and they had to describe a little bit of what they did. And so it's that document, and these were filed in the local courthouses, and they're now all housed at the National Archives in Washington. So we spent many, many trips to the National Archives to collect this data. Now, they don't let you look at the original pensions, which is probably a good thing from a preservation standpoint. You're looking at reels and reels of microfilm. But luckily, actually today, most of these pensions are transcribed and are available online. So, it's a lot easier to do this kind of research than when we started. But we have this wonderful information on Warwick that it was built in June of 1774, and this is during a conflict called Lord Dunmore's War, and it was used throughout the American Revolutionary War. Located on William Warwick's farm on the North Fork of Deer Creek. So, and you can see some of the important players in this quote. The company of Captain George Matthews coming, and where Captain George Moffett was already there engaged in building the fort. And we even have some documents, this is super unusual, that show men getting paid for 6 days building a fort. So we have names of some of the men who built this fort, and that is truly unusual. This wave of settlement in 1774 really started actually about 1768 after two very important treaties, Fort Stanwix with the Six Nations or Iroquois and hard labor with the Cherokee. Now, there had been earlier Euro-American settlement in the 1750s and 1760s, but the frontier defensive system was not working quite so well at that time. And in those cases, the area was depopulated by the white settlers. But by 1768 in these treaties, the system really had been honed. But the problem with these treaties is that they did not include some of the Ohio Native American groups, especially such as the Shawnee. Now, the British felt the Shawnee were represented because the Iroquois said, we speak for the Shawnee. We conquered them in war, and we speak for them, but the Shawnee did not agree. And so, and of course, the English, they were very anxious to make treaties. And so when the Iroquois said, we speak for the Shawnee, they probably said, great, got that covered. But it led to a lot of hostility and a lot of conflicts later. So that's why these forts were needed. I'll show you another type of document that we use for the area. These are, again, documents that would have been collected in the county courthouses. But today, most of these, we research them at the Library of Virginia, Richmond. But this is a tax list, and it's kind of like the earliest census that we have in a way. This is, and it's taken by a militia captain, George Pogue, which is interesting in itself, shows you how important the militia are. He's taking a list of the heads of households in northern Pocahontas County. And so it's like a poll tax. I'm sorry, these P's. You have to turn your head sideways, Stephen, for a P. It's a poll tax, and so we're getting the heads of the households. So there's 43 households. Each one probably represents, 4 to say 6 other persons living in that household. But there are about 18 families that we think belong to the Warwick's Fort area. Now, these tax records also do tell us more than about a poll tax or a voting tax, and I'll show you a little bit more of that in a moment. Here's 3 of the main forts in this region. Warwick's Fort that we're talking about, then a little further south, the Clover Lick Fort. Clover Lick's kind of a byway today, but it was a very important node in the early settlement area. And then Drennan's Fort just a little bit north of Marlinton. And there were some other smaller forts as well. So to go back to that tax record, 43 households, and those included 23 enslaved persons, over half of which, 14, were owned by one person, Jacob Warwick. Horse ownership varied from 0 to 80. 80, that's a lot of horses, with a mean of 11. Cattle from 0 to 88 with a mean of 12. And land ownership, 66 to 1745 with a mean of 449. So William Warwick is more in the middle of this wealth distribution, but his relative Jacob at Clover Lick was very, very wealthy. We do know from these records too, and this is especially from the pensions, some of the militia captains from Pocahontas, and many of these were at the time in Bath County, John Lewis, Samuel Vance, John Oliver, and again, George Pogue, who took that census or tax list for us. So that some of you who are local, maybe you recognize some family names in these. Okay, so finally to the archaeology. Right off, I want you to get a sense of what is our evidence in the ground. Of course, we're always looking for artifacts, and they're very informative, but the main thing that we're looking for to understand the structure of the forts are stains in the ground. We're looking for different colors of dirt, and actually also different textures. But the color is easier and maybe more apparent. So I think you can clearly see this. Well, that is the trench, the stain left from the trench that the militiamen dug to put the upright stockade logs in. And this is a hole dug for one of those logs, and that's a half. So we were actually using a little bit of heavy equipment. This was back in 2008. So this is what you call a bastion. And so that was the first bastion. We did also, in these early years, find other informative stains in the ground. On the left, you see the stain from a cellar. And the cellar even has like a little entrance area into it. And then this is not just dark brown, but stained red from burning. We think this is where a hearth or a cooking fire had been located. So to tell you a little bit about the formation of this site, it has been plowed a lot. And that is one of the reasons we feel okay to use the heavy equipment on this site. Had it not been plowed, we probably, would be not doing that and would be working differently. It's a shallow plow zone. You can see it's usually about 8 to 10 inches deep or thick. And at that point, you get into an geologically earlier soil layer that fortunately for us is a different color. On some sites, it's not such a different color from the plow zone, and you're struggling a bit with texture and dryness, and different things. But at Warwick's Fort, it's extremely cooperative. So we dig down until we hit this light soil, and then we can see where others have dug before us. And there's that cellar excavated out in a cross section. And it was used, and its end use it was used to throw trash into. But we think probably the cellar was constructed as a powder magazine. And I'll show you on our site map. It's located right here, right near the mouth of that bastion, which would be maybe a good place. And a powder magazine is where you want to store your powder, keep it dry, keep it, safe. On this map, you can see all these lines. That's where we were working with the track hoe, exposing little bits of this lighter colored soil. And after we found this bastion, we anticipated another one right in here somewhere, but we didn't find it. So, and this is just really odd how the stockade trench just stops right there, stops right there. Just doesn't match anything we had found on any other fort sites. So these Captain Matthews, Captain Moffat, they were doing some original thinking at Warwick's fort. Well, as we keep coming back every couple of years, in 2017, we also found a really interesting circular brown stain in the ground, again, where someone before us has dug. And to be honest with you, we're like, wow, do we have a Native American house here on this fort site? A much, much older structure. So we did a carbon-14 dating. No, it dates to the colonial era. So we were a little bit confused. And then Bob Sheets sort of came to the rescue with it's kind of a combination of oral history and documentary. This is a publication in the Pocahontas Times newspaper in 1934, but it's coming from family tradition passed down in the Warwick family. So it's Peter Warwick who says that his grandfather, that's William, who probably didn't actually build the fort, but he owned the land, so it's called William Warwick's Fort. He said this fort was in circular form. The roof was covered with sod and dirt to prevent fire from the enemy. And he goes on and he talks about a stockade. So this was really, really interesting to us. And let me go back. And so it's going to be right in here where that is. Also in 2017, we found a little bit more stockade trenching at one of the other ends of the fort. So this was really great progress. So here's what we sort of thought we knew in 2017. Bastion, circular structure, powder magazine, hearth, stockade trench, and a little bit more staining here, which we've subsequently cited maybe is not quite so good. But anyway, that's where we were. So that is the point that, we go to the granting agencies and say, we've got a lot of great data, but we've also got a lot of questions still. And we need, really a higher level of funding than we've been getting to be able to do more and to move more dirt, to involve more people, to bring lots more students to the site. And luckily, we were successful in getting those grants and really learning a tremendous amount. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephen now to tell you about what we've learned in this last 2 years.
Well, thank you. Yeah, good job, Kim. This is what we did this last year. As Kim said, we were searching for more evidence of the stockade or the fort itself, and then dig more hand units to find more artifacts and maybe some more refuse features, and then incorporate the school system into these digs. So we have opportunities for the local schools to learn about the history of their county. So again, here's what we had after 2017. So we wanted to add on to this. And as Kim said, that northeast corner, it turned out not to be so great. So we started with the track hoe operated by Jed Sheets. And the first thing we found that was cool was another stockade trench. You can see it right here, this dark stain, which is right here on the fort. So we've already added something that we didn't know before. We had this bastion and this stretch, and then some funniness up here. Then, even more exciting, we found a corner and a gate. You can see the stockade coming down here and turning right here. And then it continues. And then there was a gap right here, which is the gate. And then it continued. And aggravatingly, like it has all over the fort, it just stopped. This one stopped too, so they're not connected. This one stopped. So we're really kind of confused and aggravated at this point. We kept on doing the track hoe between these 2 points and found some isolated posts. As you can see, it's hard to determine whether these are part of the fort or just fence posts. It's difficult to tell unless they have something chronologically diagnostic in them, which they usually don't. But we found these, and then we expanded a little bit more, and we got another bastion. You can see it right there, the southern bastion. And it's right along the creek. The south end of the fort is along the North Fork, which is shown here. And these little stains are part of the bastion. Again, it kind of comes and goes. There's some posts in between. And then this end, which in a perfect world would have extended up to here, but it doesn't. And then this one is angled towards this side, but again, it just stops. But still, we were pretty excited because we finally found our second bastion, which we had been looking for years. It wasn't where we thought it would be, which would be sort of like over here. But anyway, beggars can't be choosers. So at that point, at the end of the 24 season, this is what we had. Some posts going over here, 2 discontinuous stretches of stockade on the south wall, a bastion, and then this part of the fort here. So it looked like, in a way, there were 2 halves of the fort, with this western half being somewhat more strongly built than the eastern half. But we weren't really too pleased that these stains here turned out not to have isolated or individual post molds in them, like these and these and these and these here. So we really weren't too sure what that was. So we came back. Well, let me back up for a second. Before we came back, we were just scratching our heads with what was going on with this discontinuous stockade trenches. There were post molds in the gaps. We also had the building with the cellar and the circular structure. We had 2 good bastions, none on the far eastern wall. And we had these 2 different halves of the fort, is exactly, at least that's what it looked like. Interestingly, if you include the whole east to west distance of the fort, it's 138 feet, which is quite a bit larger than any of the other forts we've done in the Greenbrier Valley. I think the largest other one is 110. The north-south direction is 98, which is pretty close to other forts. Possible explanation. The main explanations we need is what is in these gaps, and then also what's going on this east side. The east side. There's another number of hypotheses we could have on the gaps. Obviously, the construction has changed. They're not building a stockade in an excavated trench anymore. They could just build it more like a fence with spread out post molds like we've been getting. They also could be putting buildings in between these trenches, little log buildings. If you've ever been to Prickett's Fort in Marion County, or Boonesboro, or in Kentucky, there's log cabins that are built along the walls, and sometimes they actually are part of the wall. So that's another possibility, or it could be a combination of all those. Another possibility is, rather than the fort being built like in two sections, maybe that corner and the gate go down, and then there's another wall going to the east, farther, a little farther south, which was make the fort L-shaped. So when we came back in 2025, this is kind of what we were testing to see if that was possible. But before that, I'll give you a few more maps. Here's an example of a fort that the stockade is built more like a fence. It's meaning there's isolated post molds. These are about 20 or 25 feet apart. The bastions are also built of separate posts. You can see those there and here too, with the building in the middle. So that's a possibility with our fort. And here's some stations, this one in Kentucky and this one in Tennessee, showing buildings in the fort. And sometimes the buildings make up the back of the fort or the wall of the fort. And then there'll be little stretches of stockade in between, which if you look at this archaeologically, that would be discontinuous. Here's Logan's Fort in Kentucky, or Logan Station, which we actually excavated on. And this is a funny little sketch, but these little cross-hatching in between the buildings are stockade. So you'd have a building with no stockade, then stockade building, stockade building, stockade building. And the part of the problem is these buildings don't leave much of a underground evidence. They didn't have stone foundations. The Bledsoe's one showed up because they had little hearths. These little black squares are fireplaces. The Logan Station, we don't know, but they may not have any evidence, particularly on a site like this, which has been plowed. So those are possibilities. Another possibility is that which now we don't think is the case, but that the fort was built in multiple stages. And this is Arbuckle's Fort in Greenbrier. And we think this part of the fort was built first, and then the larger two bastion stockade built a little bit later. So again, here's what we had at the start of the end of the 24 and start of the 25. And the idea we had was that instead of the fort going like this, maybe it came down and went over here to create kind of an L-shaped fort. So our whole energy was directed towards examining this part here. And fortunately, we were lucky. We found this oval, again, discontinuous stockade, but we found this oval feature exactly kind of where it should have been. Here's another picture without humans. A curved part here, a curved part here, and then a little funny L shape there. And when we put it on the map, it's right here. And what this is actually a third bastion. So we have three bastions. They're not at opposite corners. There's a mid wall, and then what we think is this comes down and then connects over this way, and this connects this way. And this bastion would have protected this wall and also given extra protection to the gate, people coming in this way. Again, as Kim said, the bastions operate to inflate the walls. And this is a similar map, but showing our excavation units. And as you can tell, they're kind of concentrated over here because this seemed to be the more domestic area of the site, and we find more artifacts there. And when we have volunteers dig and school kids dig, they kind of like to find artifacts. So we probably should have scattered them out more, but we didn't. Now I'm going to mention some of the artifacts we found, but anyway, that's what the fort looks like now. It's a kind of rectanguloid with an L shaped over here. And again, there's a mystery as to what is in these gaps. Is it just some kind of looser fencing? Is it fencing with some log buildings or just log buildings? And we don't know. There are some posts, so we think there is some fencing going on. But it's hard to say exactly what that looked like and why those people did that instead of digging a solid trench for a stockade. Artifacts are really useful in that they help us look at what the material culture of the settlers was, their access to goods. You think of this as way out on the frontier in the 1770s and 80s. How can they get goods out here? It would be difficult. We know from historic documents that the closest store was actually in Warm Springs, which isn't too awful far away. And it was a branch store of the Matthews store, George and Sampson Matthews. Their main store was in Stanton. And this was all Augusta County until Bath County was founded in 1790. So Stanton would have been kind of their urban headquarters. And think of traveling to Stanton today on foot or on horseback. It would have been quite an ordeal to go bring your crops there to sell, bring your livestock there to sell, and then purchase or trade, barter for other goods you might need, such as coffee, maybe, sugar, firearms, other metal items you might not be able to make yourself. Also, we might look at, the cultural behavior of people. Is it like it is in the East, or is it different out here? Also, within the fort, we might identify particular activity areas, maybe where they were cooking or playing games, or maybe military activities. One of the important things we looked at also is what kind of firearms did they have? There's some documentation on this, but it's pretty loose. And then what were they eating? Our number one artifact is pretty exciting, and those are hand-wrought nails. But they can be quite useful in telling us where architecture is. And these are heavily concentrated along that building with the cellar, and also along the stockade itself, where they probably were had some horizontal members helping to hold the vertical post in. The gate, we found large spikes and hinges. Ceramics are not super common, but we do have them. And interestingly, the ones I have shown here are made in England. They're made in various parts of England, include some pretty fancy wares. This is called Littler's Blue White Salt Glazed Stoneware. And I believe all the fragments we have are from teas. They're from teapots and cups and saucers, suggesting a continuation of English tea ceremonies, tea practices. We also have a pottery called Jackfield ware, plain white salt glaze. These two are Delft ware, which is a thin glaze earthenware. This one is what's called powdered decoration, powdered purple. And then we have a fancy ware called Wealden ware, which is an early form of Wedgwood pottery from the Staffordshire district of England. We also have some plain creamware, which would have been another, which was actually these creamware was actually invented by Josiah Wedgwood, if you all have heard of him. We also have some coarse earthenware. These are redware, ceramics. They would have been mugs, might have been made out of them, large bowls, creamers, kind of utilitarian ware. And they would have been locally made, maybe not right here, but not too far from here. There would have been potteries in Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania. Another interesting English artifact was this one. It's a medicine bottle that was very popular in the middle to late 18th century, and it's called Turlington's. It's fortunately lettered, so we know exactly what it contains. Kind of hard to read for you guys, but it says Turlington's Balsam of Life. And I'm not sure what the ingredients were, but I think it made you feel better. So you can imagine what was in there. Today, or in the 19th century, early 20th, you'd probably call it a patent medicine or a elixir. Here's some more utilitarian items. Cast iron kettle and Dutch ovens, which would have been cooking vessels, cooked on an open fireplace or even out in a campfire. Two-pronged fork and some table knives and a knife blade for eating. One of our best windows into what the people were eating was animal bone remains. And at Warwick's fort, unlike the Greenbrier fort, the #1 animal bone is white-tailed deer. So that was their main protein source. The Greenbrier sites, the #1 is pig, hog, and deer is second. At Warwick's, deer first and actually cattle second and pig third. I'm supposed to end in 10 minutes. I don't think I have a problem with that. Another artifact type that's indicative of behavior of the site. Anyone know what these are? It says right here. They're smoking pipes, yeah. If you've ever been to Colonial Williamsburg or another colonial site, you'll see these. They're white clay or kaolin pipes with long stems and little bowls. These are the stem fragments. This is kind of a stem going into the bowl, and then these are bowl fragments. They're very fragile and break quite easily. Oftentimes the stems would break and they would keep smoking them until they ran out. But this was very popular at Warwick's fort. Clothing items. We've got buttons, lots of buttons, brass buttons. They wore shirts and waistcoats. We call it a vest, and then regular overcoats. They wore what do we call them? Kind of knickers type. They wore, Kim, what do they call those? Yeah, pants are kind of the knee. Yeah, well, not trousers go all the way down. Well, culottes, I guess, is what they used to call it. But anyway, these kind of pants had a lot of buttons and also buckles at the knee. And we've got smaller buckles, lots of buttons. They would have a kind of a fly at the front with buttons that you undid when you wanted to go to the bathroom. These were men's clothing. Women's were dresses that had some buttons in them, particularly on the back, and some buckles. These two buckles are shoe buckles. Lace shoes had not been invented yet. So So you had a strap with a shoe buckle. And then this is what they call a sleeve button. We would call it a cufflink. And this is a really important artifact here. Can you see that number there? It says 17. It used to say 1744, but the two fours fell off right before we took this picture. So I decided to take a picture quickly because it's really these buttons these two are solid brass. These are domed buttons, so there's two pieces of brass. This one was kind of I would call it pot metal. It was a poor quality metal. And what it is, they've made a mold out of a Spanish coin, a quarter real. And these were worn in the Revolutionary War as a protest against English money. What kind of money do we have? Do we have pounds? We have dollars. Who had dollars in colonial time? Spain. The 8 real was $1. It's called the Spanish dollar. So that was pretty neat find there. And then we had some more jewelry. We had these intaglios. We had 2 of them, one with the face of a man and the other with flowers. And then we had a glass bead here. This one we sent to some experts, and everyone said that was George III, who was the King of England at that time. And what is he doing here? Well, the fort was built in the Dunmores where we were still part of Great Britain. And perhaps this was accidentally lost, or perhaps when the fort was reoccupied during the American Revolution, they got mad and just threw it away. Of course, we don't know for sure, but those are 2 hypotheses. But it was quite an interesting find. And these look kind of big, but it's like that big. Here's getting into arms. During this period, the only hand weapon was a flintlock. You'd have a flintlock musket, which is smoothbore, or a flintlock rifle, which is rifled. And we found some parts of the guns. This is a side plate called a serpentine side plate because it looks like kind of like a snake. And then this is actually 2 pieces of lead that was a patch. Yeah. Sure. Sure. He asked if we found arrowheads, and this mostly what we found actually are spear points, because this site had been occupied for thousands of years by Native Americans. And as far as we can tell from radiocarbon dating, it was abandoned in about 1500. That's the last occupation. We have some triangular arrow points that could date from the colonial period, but it's hard to tell because they can be as old as 1000 AD and as late as 1780. It's just difficult to tell. And we know from historic records that Native Americans were also armed with flintlock muskets as well by, say, like the 1750s and onward. In fact, this serpentine side plate is usually off of a trade gun, which means a gun that was manufactured and traded with Native Americans. And they typically were not rifles, they were smoothbores. How this one got here, we're not really sure. But it could have been captured by a settler or traded with a Native American. But it would be unusual, but possible for settlers or the militia to have a gun like that. The main artifacts we find from firearms are gun flints and musket balls. Most of the gun flints, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 right here, are made out of French flint. They're from France. And they would have been brought in barrels, eventually probably into the Atlantic. Some eventually got to Stanton, maybe down to maybe settlers bought them in Stanton, or maybe they got down to the store in Warm Springs and were bought there. During the wars, the county and colonial government, state government would have supplied these. So the colony / state of Virginia would have supplied these during times of war. So they would have tried to ship them out to the western frontier. And two things we can learn from these gun flints. This is actually a Dutch or British flint here. You can see it's a different color. Two things we can learn. One is that these are about half the size they started out with, which means they've been flint knapped down, which so this one's real, these two are really narrow, which means there was a shortage of them. Normally if they had perfect access to gun flints, they wouldn't have been having to flint knap them down and keep using them. They would have thrown them away and gotten a new one. The other thing we can learn is that the size of them is they're not military weapon size like a brown vest. They're much smaller. They're for a rifle, or what was called a Fowler. A rifle is a rifled musket, and a Fowler is smoothbore, but civilian size, not military size. And this is a very unusual artifact. It's actually a flint knapper. There's only a few known in the United States. And men would have had these to sharpen their flints. You had to maintain a straight edge on these things or they wouldn't work. This one is curved in the back and continued to be used, and is probably used as a strike-a-light, which is how you make a fire. Flint on steel. Here's musket balls. All 6 of these have been fired. This one's dropped, we call them, and that's some melted lead, probably in the process of making a bullet. And like the flints, these are 45 to 55 caliber. They're rifle size or Fowler size. They're not military musket size, which is would be about 69 to 75 caliber. And here's a distribution of the musket balls, and the Fs are fired. And this kind of interesting pattern, because 4 of them are over here, and along the south wall, 2 on the east wall, and west wall, and 2 on the east, and 2 on the west. The fired balls, we can't say 100%, but they're likely to have been fired by Native Americans into the fort, suggesting there was maybe an attack on the south side, maybe some firing back and forth on other sides. The D or drop balls, this is an interesting concentration here along the stockade wall, but outside of it, they may have dropped them while they were passing through the gate. Kind of difficult to say. And then that's the end of the slides, except here's the conclusions. And as Kim said, this is an unusual design compared to our other forts. The gaps in the stockade are very confusing and enigmatic, though we have some possible explanations. Other buildings in between is one of them, though we haven't found any evidence of these buildings. We know from the forts in Kentucky and Tennessee that this is not uncommon to have buildings along the fort walls. And then the distribution of musket balls suggests maybe there was an attack on the south side and maybe the east as well. And there's no good documentation of a major attack here, but there's a couple of mentions of possible attacks at the fort. more like a skirmish, I guess you'd say. And then thanks again to the Sheets family for supporting us. And we have our official site, our former site greeter, Susan, who has passed away, but she had a long and happy life on the farm. Right. And she liked the cool, moist back dirt, particularly in the summer.
Are on display at the museum. Oh, you said, okay. Oh, sorry. Well, sorry, online people, you can visit online, right? But for all the local folks, if you haven't been to Warwick's Fort, or if you haven't been in a while, maybe you haven't been since the museum was built and opened, there's really a lot to see there, and lots more pictures of things that we have found. And, we just really didn't have time. We were focusing on this, what is the structure of the fort, but there's many other things that you can learn there. And then if you didn't get one when you came in, we have booklets of our this recent year, 2 years of excavation, at the orange booklet that you're welcome to take with you. And I guess we have any online questions we need to address, or? Okay.
Take some time for that. If anybody online has questions, you can pop them in the Q&A, and I'm happy to read them out here.
Any questions? Yeah. The question was, what is a post mole? It's an archaeological term. It's a stain in the ground where a post used to be. And it can be formed in one of two ways. The post just rots and it leaves a darker organic stain. And the other is the post was pulled out and the darker topsoil falls into the hole left by the removal. Yeah, there's one over there on the lower left. Again, as Kim pointed out, the subsoil here is a yellowish brown silty clay. And the organic topsoil or cultural features are darker, loamy, silty loam soil. So they're pretty easy to distinguish between the two. And a post can be anywhere from, like 3 or 4 inches to 10 or 12 inches, depending on the size of the post. Sure. Well, we just want to, I think he said, why do we search for what these soldiers left behind? We're just interested in what life was like on the frontier for these soldiers. And some of the occupants were civilians as well. As Kim said, if Native Americans were seen in the area, settlers would run to the fort and they might stay there for a week or maybe months, we don't know. So we're interested in what kind of clothes they had, what kind of guns they had, what kind of dishes they had, what kind of food they ate, things like that. Yeah, there's one back there. She asked if they kept a storehouse. We don't have any documentation. We just really have that one cellar feature. It could have been that food goods were stored down there. If you read about frontier life in general, they might have preserved meat by smoking it. We don't have a smokehouse. They might have also, made jerky and then stored things in barrels in the cellar. Other foods like potatoes, they could have stored in the. I didn't mention plant foods, but we do have evidence of corn, also local nuts and local berries being used. Right, right. Yeah, it's hard to say from the archaeological evidence. I would guess that they did, that they would store some food. When people came into the fort in times of danger, it would have been a good idea if they brought some food with them. One thing we know from the animal remains is, they had some livestock there that was, on the hoof from the butchering of cattle and pigs. It seems like the whole animal was there. But the deer, they field dressed them. So I think they had men that were, again, from not documents at Warwick's, but in general from other sites, that were good hunters, and they would go out hunting, which would have been quite dangerous. And then they would bring back, the meatier parts of the deer. Bob? Yeah.
I think we have a couple on.
Oh, you do those. There's, yeah. Oh, yeah. People have found on some sites, if you have a waterlogged condition, leather can be preserved, and sometimes they call them brogans. They were shoes, kind of rough shoes that people had, and they didn't have a left or right shoe. There was just a middle shoe. So you just did the best you could. Yeah. If you were well-to-do, you might have a fancier shoe, but just the frontier brogans were pretty simple. We don't have leather preservation here, so yeah.
As a community center, what types of goods pass through the area in general, or from the things you found at Fort Warwick?
Well, I mean, we are limited in the archaeological data of what's preserved well. So we're losing all the cloth, we're losing all the paper, but we're getting the more durable things like the ceramics, the glass, some metal we lose to rusting, so we always have to keep in mind that we have a very small subsample of what they would have had. But certainly, the ceramics, even though because of the plowing, they're frustratingly tiny on this site, they show a wide range of, decorative types. They show expensive ceramics, decorated ceramics, as Stephen mentioned, the forms of the teapots and tea cups and saucers. We can connect to that behavior of having tea. We don't know if they stop all activities at 4 o'clock every day for, afternoon tea or whatever. But the trade gun, the side plate, the serpentine side plate, that is a definite trade item to respond. So we don't have a lot of money coinage. That would have been very dear. We do find mostly what either gets broken and then discarded or lost. So again, we're getting, we have to do the best we can with a small sample. Can you think of other trade things to mention? But but we're certainly we don't have a picture of them being isolated with no material goods. They've got the up-to-date ceramics, and the fashion, they seem to be pretty up to date, and some fancy things like the little intaglias, those might be considered jewelry items. So it wasn't just the most basic of rustic, linen shirts and things like that. It was also some fancier items.
The question related to ground disturbance, earth moving over in the past, that, is the landscape, I guess, kind of is the landscape the same as it was during the 1770s, or has it changed? Yeah, we kind of take that into account. The the landscape overall, I think the major changes have been plowing, cultivation, and there's probably a certain amount of erosion that's occurred because of that we can't really measure very well. You know, as Kim said, the plow zone is like about 10 inches, and then we hit the subsoil. It's possible that it could have been deeper at one time, higher up, and we've lost some of it at the top. The area of the site's pretty flat, so I think a lot of it probably hasn't had a whole lot of erosion, but as you get towards the edges that it may have. And we know right along from talking to Bob's cousin Alan that there have been some blowouts along the North Fork, right along the edge. It's real steep there. So there could be part of the fort that's gone. We really don't know for sure. If there's a moderate amount of erosion in some areas, you know, some artifacts could be down the hill or they could have gone into the creek. But it's just something we can't really control. If we're doing, say, like a ancient site, paleo site, Pleistocene site, we would be much more observant about geomorphological changes and try to reconstruct the environment in, say, like 12,000 years ago versus now, because we know they're quite different. But the 1770s environment was pretty similar, except for, you know, some of the trees have been cut and haven't grown back. And one thing interesting, a difference we didn't mention in this fort compared to the other ones is it has a much greater variety of tree species used to build the fort. The other forts are almost all white oak, and this is just a big variety. And we know from the survey calls that there was a variety of trees here, but it's also, this is the only, another difference with this site is that it's the only one with a late Native American occupation, late meaning up to 1500. And 1000 to 1500, the Native Americans were agriculturalists. They were growing corn and other crops. And so it's possible that this site was more cleared than the other ones. So there wasn't enough white oak to build the whole fort. They had to use a variety of different kinds of wood. Just a hypothesis. Yeah. Charcoal, we have to have burned pieces of wood, and then we can send them to a specialist. It's like the animal bone, we'll send that to a specialist, and the plant remains. One thing we do is when we dig a post mole or the cellar or the stockade trench, we'll take soil samples that we don't screen, and we run that through a process called flotation, and we can find really tiny little things that would go through the screen. And a plant remains like charred seeds and nuts, and charcoal will be recovered in that process. And then we send it to a specialist.
So we'll just go ahead and thank our specialist, Dr. Jack Ross, and he even came to Fort Warwick's like, what, last summer? When was that? I can't remember that all these seasons run together, but he came all the way from Minneapolis to help us excavate, and he carried back like about 10 big bags of dirt. The car was like almost, too low to the ground to process and get these samples out. So it's a microscopic identification that he makes on this charcoal. And also we go ahead and thank Dr. Terry Martin for all the many years of work identifying the animal bone for us on these forts.
That's correct. Yeah, they were in, as Kim mentioned earlier, they were the militia, and pretty much all white men in the county had to belong to the militia. There were exceptions. But if you were between about 16 and 50, they changed it off and on. You had to go to militia muster. You had to show up. You had to have either a musket, a cartridge box, and bayonet, or a rifle and a powder horn and a tomahawk. If you were too poor to have it yourself, the county would supply you with one. And you were paid, you're definitely paid. And if you were in a war situation, you were supplied with powder and shot, gun flints, and food, but you just had your own personal clothes. You had your own gun for the most part, which would have probably been your hunting rifle. There are no military uniforms out here on the frontier in the militia stations. There were some forts on the Ohio River, Fort Pitt, Fort Randolph, that had Continental soldiers stationed there. But for the regular frontier forts, there were no official military people. It was just militia. And militia was organized like the Army. The head of the militia was the county lieutenant. And then you went down the line. It was basically a single regiment with a colonel, staff officers, colonel, lieutenant, colonel, major, and then companies with captain, lieutenants, ensigns, sergeants, corporals, and men in the ranks, who were most of them. And I'm too old. Tim's too old. But a lot of people here might have been men. It was men. African Americans and Native Americans could be in the militia, but they were not armed. They were either laborers, or they could have been drum and fife, or have other roles. And those would have been free blacks, not enslaved people.
This discussion made me think of something I didn't mention, and I didn't in response to our online question too. We have maybe kind of an interesting, unusual situation at Fort Warwick, in that one of the builders, George Matthews, was also this major store partner in the major store for the whole region. You know, the Matthews Trading Post in Greenbrier County is the first store there. You know, their big base in Stanton, but the store in Warm Springs. So he could have been bringing all kinds of goods. You know, during Lord Dunmore's war, he had a strong role in supplying all the militia that gathered at Camp Union, now Lewisburg, you know, over 1,300 men there. So Warwick's fort has the potential, through the connection, you know, to one of its builders being a store supplier, to have extraordinary access to goods, really. Just a thought.
Another point with Matthews and Moffett is these people came from Stanton and built this fort. And then, as the quote said, they all went to Camp Union in Lewisburg and then went to Point Pleasant and were in the Battle of Point Pleasant. And Sergeant Kennerly and his people, what was it, 16, I think, stayed here and garrisoned the fort, but the others all left and were, if you're from West Virginia, you probably heard of the Battle of Point Pleasant, which was the culmination of Dunmore's War in October 10th, 1774. And then they returned, I think, in early November, and then they probably disbanded the fort then. But later, Matthews became a colonel and brigadier general in the Continental troops in the Rev War. And then he later became the governor of Georgia. So he's actually a fairly well-known person. And Moffett became later the county lieutenant of Augusta County and was also a prominent settler in the Stanton area. There was another question, seemed like, but maybe not. Oh, yeah. Normally they would just go to the muster, a few times a year, but times of war, it would be difficult. And one of the neat things about one of the best records we have are these pension applications, which were in the 1830s. So these guys were pretty ancient when they applied for their pension. Some of them are widow pensions, but a number of these mentioned that while they were at the fort, they would leave the fort in a group and they would tend each other's farms. And they would say, while some guarded, others plowed. So they had kind of an organized system to keep track of the farms, because as Kim said, most of the ratings season was between April and October, November. And of course, those are also times when you plant and times when you weed and times when you harvest. So they had to watch out. But again, the unlike Kentucky, where the forts actually became towns, they usually went back to their cabins often, because the danger wasn't as bad here as it was in central Kentucky or middle Tennessee, where they were just so far out west. They really lived in fortified town all the time. This site, I think we're mostly done. I think, we obviously have some questions, but I don't think we're going to answer a lot of those questions. We particularly, were there what the fencing or cabins were like in between the stockades. We've looked hard. And I think we might continue some educational programs, but large scale excavation, I don't think so.
We're always going to be hopeful for new documentary evidence to come forward too. Somebody's George Matthews' diary gets discovered or something, or actually, we're thinking about going and looking at some George Matthews papers, because he was so famous. He's got papers all over the place, although most of them seem to be later, but who knows? But it's possible new evidence will come to light. But I think we've because of the plowing, it just limits, there's some questions that are going to probably remain questions, and that's okay. We want to thank everyone again for coming, and we can also continue discussions up, front, or you're welcome to come up and look at the artifacts, and be sure to get a booklet. And if we run out, we have more in the truck, we can get more out. So probably the students probably have other places they got to be.
Feel free to come on up if you'd like to take a closer look. I will just remind everybody, we have another talk Saturday evening. So if you're interested in our book talk and star party, come on back Saturday.